Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another recap from the Ottawa December Open. And this time it is round number 4. So, if you watched the previous 3 recaps, I started the tournament in an amazing form. I started with 3 out of 3, including a win over a Grandmaster and the top seed of the tournament. So, I was feeling really confident that I can actually go and win the tournament. So in round 4, I was facing FIDE Master Daniel Zhu, who's rated 2163 FIDE, but his peak has been over 2300 FIDE. So he's definitely a little bit underrated. Like, he's a young chess player, and definitely he didn't decline over the last year, and he was 2300 last year. So kind of an unfortunate pairing rating wise, but I was confident. I was feeling really good about myself after winning the first 3 games. So even though I had the black pieces, I was really trying to go there and win the game. So before the game, I was debating what to do against him, and I knew against my main opening, which is the Karu Khan, he plays the Panov variation. And I knew since he's a young player, he's definitely going to look into my games and find something against my repertoire. So there are generally 2 approaches here. Sometimes you can play a totally different line. Let's say I can play Sicilian, I can play French, I can play E5. Or I can play Karu Khan, but try to diversify within the opening, which I think the second is better because I already know all different lines against the Carcon. I have a lot of experience. So if my opponent surprises me with something that, as they say, he was cooking the shadows, like some new opening that he had prepared and haven't used yet, then I would be okay because I already have some sort of experience against all different tries against the Carcon. So I decided to play the Karukan and prepare something new against the panel. So the game started with e4. I played c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, and now c4. And this is called the Panov attack in the Karukan. So white usually gets an isolated queen pawn in this opening, but in return he gets a lot of activity. So I played knight f6, he played knight c3, and I played knight c6. And so far, I have been playing what I have been playing before, so no surprises just yet in this game. And he was the one who came with the first surprise, actually. He played the move knight f3, which is the main line, but when I was looking at his game, he always played bishop g5 in this position. And previously, against bishop g5, I played 1 game in the database where I took on c4. Usually white takes with a bishop, and the idea is that white wants to sacrifice this pawn on d4 for the activity. So one line goes queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, and then long castle. Black is up a pawn, but white has a massive lead in development, and a move like e5 is met by f4. And all of a sudden, like, this is still very playable, but black needs to be very careful, and the route to equality is very, very narrow. So the best move here, instead of taking on d4 first, is to start with the move h6, attack the bishop on g5. So if white takes, black will take ef6, and even though white has a passed pawn, this passed pawn usually becomes a weakness in the endgame, where black blockades with bishop d6, and then in the long run, this isolated passed pawn is going to be a weakness. I have won some blitz and rapid games in this line against strong players. So usually white plays bishop to h4, and now black takes on d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, long castle, and now there's, even though e5 is still the main move, I found out that there's this interesting option g5, where instead of saving my knight, I counterattack the bishop on h4. And this leads to some crazy lines that I had prepared for that game in 2023 that I played against Jeffrey Zhao. I don't want to reveal like all of the lines that I had prepared, but this idea was very strong and rare. And my opponent in 2023 was shocked by this idea, and I managed to get a huge advantage and win the game. So I was sure that Daniel is going to see that line, and see that game and prepare something against this line and at least get equality. So against bishop g5, I had something new prepared, which again I'm not going to reveal for the next games that I will have coming up. But what happened was Daniel played the move knight f3, and historically against knight f3, I have been playing bishop g4, where the line usually goes in a very forcing way. White takes on d5, knight takes d5, queen b3, and now the line goes like this: bishop f3, gf3, e6, queen takes b7, knight takes d4, bishop b5 check, knight takes b5. Now, white usually gives this check on c6 first. I can't blockade with a queen because my rook hangs. So I have to go here, and here there are like two different lines again. Like one line is queen takes b5, which leads to an endgame after queen d7, knight d5, queen d5, queen d5, e d5. And it's an equal endgame where it's equal, but it's imbalanced. Like white has the outside majority, black has a better pawn structure. There's a pawn on d5, which is a passed pawn. It can be a strength, it can be a weakness. And also, like, one downside to black's position is that the king is a little bit vulnerable. So usually black proceeds with something like king e6, bishop b4, rerouting to b6, putting the king on f5 maybe sometimes. And I really didn't want to play this endgame. And plus that, there's this other crazy line where white goes queen c5 check instead of taking the knight. And if I save the knight, they take on d5, e d5 castles, and the line goes something like queen c8, queen takes d5, queen b7, and black is up a piece, but the king is wide open. And I knew Daniel is an amazing attacking player. He has a great sense of attack and initiative and tactics. So I really didn't want to go into these sorts of lines with him. So when he surprised me with knight f3, he actually told me after the game that he was planning to take on b5 with a queen. But I didn't want to go into these sorts of lines with my king on e7. So I prepared a counter surprise for him in this position. And I played this move a6, which I never played in my life. And he was already out of prep. And you might ask, what's the main idea of a6? I can just show you one very interesting idea. So like if white takes on d5 and plays queen b3, like the main line with bishop to g4, the interesting idea for black is to go bishop to e6. So it looks like I'm hanging the pawn on b7, but the problem is queen b7 loses to knight a5. And now, as you can see, the pawn on a6 plays a pivotal role in controlling the b5 square. Now the queen is actually trapped on b7. So the best move for white is actually to play knight g5 here, and I check this line where I take, I win a pawn, and I get like these doubled e pawns, but I can still get to develop with g6, bishop g7 castle, and play is pretty much equal. So that didn't happen. Daniel played the move h3 here, which I actually saw before the game that against h3, the best move is to take on c4 and then play e6. But I saw that in many of these lines, he can just simply go d5 and then everything liquidates in the center. Now he goes d5 and everything liquidates. I have no issues to equalize, but I'm never going to win the game. That's the main problem. And I suspect Daniel would have tried to go for some sort of attack with the IQP, knowing his style, but I still didn't want to give him a chance to just go d5 and liquidate everything. Plus, I didn't have the chance to like really prepare the IQP aggressive lines deeply, where they go like bishop g5, create some battery on the diagonal, and like black needs to be really careful with the bishop outside the pawn chain, inside the pawn chain. So I decided to play g6, even though I knew this is a slight inaccuracy. And the reason it's an inaccuracy is that white can play the move c5. That's the only move that gives white some sort of advantage. And the thing is, now with a pawn on c5, I can't really go bishop g4. Pawn on h3 stops bishop g4. So I have to develop normally, and the best way to break this wall of pawns on the queen side is to immediately go b6. Otherwise, white can start consolidating, put the knight on b6, and things can go wrong here. Also the bishop coming to f4. So I have to go b6 fast, and we get a position like this where there's an isolated pawn on d4, but white has decent development and two outside pawns on the queen side, which can be dangerous in a potential endgame. But I was still fine to play this position. It's not the end of the world, so I was ready for that. But instead, he didn't go c5. He played c takes d5, which was the first step in a wrong direction. I took back with a knight, and he started developing bishop e2, bishop g7, castles, rook e1, all normal moves. But now, white kind of has this isolated pawn on d4, but in return, usually in these IQP positions, white gets some sort of attack against my king, but now my king is 100% safe. And that's the reason black basically has a free advantage playing against this isolated pawn on d4. So here, I was debating a little bit how to develop my bishop, whether to go bishop e6 or to go bishop f5. And I correctly decided to go bishop e6. So the idea of bishop e6 is that I block the e file. You might ask why. The reason is a move like bishop f5 allows an idea like bishop g5. All of a sudden, with a rook here and a bishop pointing towards e7 and this being a pin, there are all sorts of like knight d5, bishop e7 ideas in the air combined with some bishop c4. So this can kind of be annoying, and I have to go with some h6 g5 and weaken my king to kick this bishop. So my idea was to go bishop e6, and in case he goes knight g5, now play bishop f5. And now by provoking the knight to g5, first of all, there's no bishop g5, and second, the pawn on d4 is pretty much hanging. And there's this other idea that computers suggest against knight g5, and that's to just simply take. Allow the double pawns, and my point is, now the f2 pawn is pretty much weak. And if he tries to defend it with a knight, then I can undermine the knight with knight f6. And here, black is basically having the upper hand. Like, I'm up a pawn, and there's really not enough compensation. Yes, I do have the double pawns, but I can always go e5, consolidate the bishop, and there's just so much pressure on f2. So understandably, Daniel didn't go for knight g5, and he played the move knight e4. And his idea is to put this knight on c5 and start attacking my bishop and my pawn. And here was another debate that I had in the game. I was thinking whether to put this queen on b6 or put the queen on c7. So the queen on b6 puts pressure on the d4 pawn, and queen on c7 allows ideas like knight f4, maybe some doubling on the c file. But I correctly again decided to put a queen on b6 because now the pressure on the d4 pawn is way too much. Rook is also coming to d8, and all of a sudden he's in some sort of trouble. So understandably he plays knight c5, and here I played the most human move, which is bishop f5. But there's this interesting idea that computers suggest, which I really didn't consider that deeply in the game, but it makes a lot of sense. And the idea is to simply go rook a d8, allow knight e6, f e6, and my point is now there's literally no way to defend the pawn on d4. There are three attackers, just two defenders, and bishop e3 is impossible because now the b2 pawn is going to start hanging. So black is effectively winning a pawn here, and I don't think white has enough compensation. Again, like after taking everything on d4, there's going to be pressure on the f2 pawn as well, combined with a queen. So the best white can do here is actually to go like queen c2, and then after the trade, just go bishop f3. And they have a little bit of compensation, but definitely not enough. Anyways, I played bishop f5, provoking g4, and then dropping the bishop all the way back to c8. So far I'm playing really well. I'm putting a lot of pressure. Looks like I'm coming back, but now he has so many weaknesses. d4 is weak. There's weaknesses for the king. My king is completely safe. My bishop on g7 is very strong. So given the fact that his king is a little bit weak, he decides to trade the queens. He plays queen b3. I trade the queens off. And now I play this nice move, knight d to b4. And all of a sudden, I was starting to feel really confident about this game. So we have an endgame. There's definitely no attack against my king. He has an IQP on d4. And there are also threats, like there's knight c2 coming to put more pressure on d4 and also fork the rooks. So like if he goes something like rook d1, I can still go something like bishop e6 and even threaten knight takes a2 ideas, the bishop pointing towards the knight. So he decides to go bishop d1 and give up the bishop pair. I saw that with bishop d1, he allows knight d3, and I can get the bishop pair as well. Knight d3, rook e2, knight takes c1, rook takes c1, and here I play the best move again, bishop to e6, completely blockading the IQP on d4. And now there's so much pressure. There are two strong bishops pointing towards the diagonal, and also there's a knight coming to b4. There are rooks coming to put more pressure in the central files, and my opponent is definitely in deep trouble here. So I was feeling really confident in this position, and it gets even better. So he plays bishop c2, and I play the best move again, knight b4. Maybe not the best move, but definitely one of the best. And here he played the most human move, which I was expecting him to play, and he did. But there's a more accurate way for white to play. He played bishop b1, which is understandable. The pawn on a2 is hanging, and also he really don't want to play with two knights against two bishops. That's an absolute disaster in this type of position with an open board. So he defends both, and there was this insane resource knight c5. So in the game, I thought that knight c5 doesn't work because I simply take on a2, attacking the rook on c1, and after rook a1, bishop d5, I'm hitting the knight on f3. So I was thinking I might be up a pawn. But then he has bishop e4. And if I drop the knight back, the pawn on b7 is going to hang in the end of the line. And even though black is still better and is going to press a little bit here, white is very close to equalizing in this position. But Daniel understandably played a more human move. He played bishop to b1. And here again, I kept playing really well. I started fighting for the c file with rook a c8. Now, the big threat is to simply take the rook and go bishop d5, attacking the knight. And once I dismantle this knight, I can even win the pawn on d4. So like there are all sorts of threats. There's also this big threat, by the way, that I can take on b3. So like let's say he plays a random move like knight g5, which is a big blunder. I can take on b3. So now the rook on c1 is hanging, and if he trades the rooks and takes on b3, I go rook c1 check and I win a piece. So like Daniel is under big pressure in this position. So he has to trade the rooks. Now again, there's this threat of taking and going rook c1. So he goes rook e1 and guarding the back rank. So far it's move 23. I have the bishop pair. I have the open file. And there's an isolated queen pawn to play against. So I have a decisive advantage. This is the only moment in the game that I literally had a decisive advantage. And I messed up. So I was really feeling confident here. I was also up on time. And I was feeling like I'm going to win this game. But here I made a huge mistake. And the reason I made this mistake was that for some reason I felt like I need to keep one pair of rooks on the board to have better winning chances. So I was a little bit worried that he's going to go rook c1, trade a pair of rooks, and then hold on to the d4 pawn for his dear life. And somehow like go some bishop e4, create some counterplay, or some knight c5, create some counterplay, and I was slightly worried about that. So I played the move rook d8. And the idea is that I'm putting some pressure with some bishop takes d4 ideas. Of course, I need to be careful about the d7 pawn, but I was like, I'm at least avoiding some rook c1 ideas, because now if he goes here, I'm going to take on d4, which is correct, but there are more important things to worry about. And he instantly exploited my move with this amazing move knight c5. So given this knight c5 move being strong, as we see in the rest of the game, the best I could have done was this move b6. It's prophylaxis against knight c5. very important concept. Like in chess, you really need to see your opponent's ideas first. Knight c5 is a very important idea, and by playing this, I effectively paralyze white. Like, they can't move this knight, because if they do, then bishop d5 is going to come, and the d4 pawn is going to be really weak. And if they can't move this knight, then they can't push the pawn, because the knight is going to hang. If they can't push the pawn, they can't move the bishop. They can't move this knight because it weakens the pawn. So like white is basically paralyzed. And I have a very simple threat of just going a5, a4 and dislodge the knight. So the only thing that remains is this move rook c1 to try and trade the rooks. But then after the trade, I missed that I have this nice backward knight move, knight to c6. It's not that difficult. I don't know why I missed it. Like when I see this line right now, I feel like I should have found it. It's not that difficult. So I'm attacking the pawn on d4, and if they defend it, then just bishop d5. Attacking the knight, there's no way to defend, and black is going to win a pawn and have the bishop pair in an endgame, and it should be a pretty routine win. So that was a missed opportunity to go b6 and just completely paralyze my opponent. And I played rook d8, and now he plays knight c5. And the point is, after bishop d5, now he goes bishop e4. And even though he's hanging the a2 pawn, I can't really take it, because then after the trade of the bishop, both b7 and e7 are going to hang. And white is getting counterplay. That's the problem. So I made this second inaccuracy. This one, it was a little bit more difficult. I played b6, which seemed a very natural move, dislodging the knight. So like, I am kicking this knight back to b3, but in the process, white gets to trade my bishop pair. Like when you have the bishop pair, you don't want to trade one set of bishops, because then the bishop, the lone bishop on the dark squares loses a lot of its power. So the best move, which I didn't even consider in the game, was this move knight c2. The idea is that if he takes my knight, now I take the knight on f3. And after takes, the point is there's no knight takes b7. And the idea is that I go king f8, attack the rook. Rook c7 is met by bishop b6, attacking the rook again. And the thing is, if he takes my rook like this, the knight is trapped on d8 at the end of the variation. So this was a little bit more difficult to see. And if they don't take knight b7 and try to defend the knight, then I can do something like this, reroute the bishop, and drop this bishop back to c6, and looks like a symmetrical structure, but of course with two bishops in a very open position, white is going to suffer in this position. I think it's still holdable with correct play, but it's pure torture for white to play such a position. So yeah, I played b6, trades happened, knight b3. Now, the problem is kind of becoming the fact that even though there's this IQP still and there's no play, there's just one weakness. Like when an opponent has one weakness, obviously there are weaknesses like this, pawn on a2 as well, but the main weakness is the pawn on d4. Usually in these situations, when there's only one weakness, you need to create a second avenue. You need to create a second weakness to win the game. Otherwise, they're just going to focus all of their forces on the pawn, and they're just going to hold on to their dear life. So I played e6, slight inaccuracy again. I think king f8 was better, because I defend my pawn, and in the process, I get my king closer to the center. I will get back to that very soon. So I played e6, and I'm attacking the pawn on a2, and I was hoping he goes a3, which runs into knight d3, attacking the rook and the pawn. And after rook e2, then simply rook b5, winning the game. Obviously, knight f d2 runs into bishop h6, and the pressure is just too much on the b file. So he correctly decides to go a4, stopping rook b5. And here I thought I was winning. I played knight d3, and I was like, oh, I'm winning. And my logic was, he can't go rook e2 because then knight f4 is coming, winning the pawn on h3. And if he goes rook b1, now I have a very nice idea to win the game. I can simply reroute my rook to the c file. Like, if he goes rook b1, the rook is going to get stuck behind the b pawn forever. And I can go rook d8, rook c8, and just infiltrate on the c file. Maybe even here to put pressure on the a4 pawn. So he correctly decides to give up the h3 pawn and go for the active defense with rook e2. And here I spent a long time and I started panicking. So here I still could fight for an advantage, but I literally started panicking. So I saw knight f4, obviously that was my initial idea to win the pawn, and it wins a pawn. But then I started getting worried. I saw rook c2, knight takes h3, king h2, now my knight is hanging. And here I saw two different lines. So first, I saw that after knight f4, rook c6, all of a sudden, these pawns are getting really vulnerable. There's no real way to defend a pawn on b6. And if I go b5 after a5, this a pawn is going to become a fast runner, and I might even be in danger of losing the game. So like, white basically gets a lot of counterplay. So then I started thinking, what if I go knight g5 to win a tempo on the knight here? But I started like seeing some ghosts around here. Like I was seeing some crazy lines like takes, and rook c6, where I wasn't really sure at the end of each of these lines what's going to be the result. I actually saw this line with rook b4. I think I did see this line with rook b4. Yes. I think I did see this line with rook b4, and I saw that I'm winning at the end of the line. But the reason I rejected this was something along the lines of him defending the pawn with some f3 or king g3, and then going for rook c6. And then I think king h3 or f3 just to not allow h5. And then rook c6 coming. This is still apparently like -1, but I wasn't really sure about that. Apparently, he also has this idea of giving a check and then going knight e5. And all of a sudden, with a knight on e5 guarding the pawn, maybe I saw this. I don't exactly remember what I saw during the game, but maybe I saw this line with some knight d7 ideas in the air and some rook c6 back. And I was kind of worried that white is having enough counterplay. So, understandably, I didn't go for this, but actually the best line is to go knight f4, rook c6, and this is what I was scared of. But I have this insane idea of h5, attacking the pawn on g4. I saw that, but then I saw g5, and I didn't find anything here. But there's this very nice move, e5, which I totally missed in the game. So I'm threatening to take on d4. He has to take back. And now after bishop e5, the thing is, rook b6 is met by bishop b2, and if he takes on e5, something like takes, here, rook a6, rook g2, I will get 3 connected passers on the king side, and also his king is going to get stuck in the back rank, and this should be pretty much winning. I will even win the pawn on b2. So the best that white has here is not to take the bishop, but to take on b6, take on, like, drop the knight back, attack the bishop and the pawn, and we get a position like this, which is still kind of unclear, but it is clear that at least black is the one pressing. Like, I'm not going to lose this game. I'm definitely the one pressing with the protected passer on h5, but still a lot of work to do, and maybe it's holdable with correct play. So here was the main mistake that completely lost my advantage. And here's another point. Like, remember at one point I said that instead of e6, it was better to play king f8. Now you can see why. Imagine I had my king on f8 instead of and a pawn on e7 instead of this position. Then I could play something like king e8, king d7, and stop the rook from infiltrating on c6. But now my king is simply far away. So here, after a long thing, I decided to just keep this knight on d3, so that if he goes for my pawns, I can go for his pawns. So what I missed basically was that my idea was to reroute this bishop to d6, and that basically makes this knight f4, knight h3 more venomous, because there's no king h2 with a bishop on d6. But this plan is simply too slow. He plays rook c6, and now, even though he doesn't get any sort of passed pawn on the outside, after mass liquidations, from distance, somehow I thought that this position can possibly be a little bit difficult to play for him. But I missed the move that he played next, which kind of kills the game, and that's rook a5. Trading the rooks. With the rooks, it can be tricky. With the rooks, it can be tricky because I can maybe bring this knight to f4, and then maybe bring the rook to b2, and all of a sudden, with all these weaknesses, it's not going to be so easy to defend. Even though, like, computer claims it's pretty much equal, but I think rook a5 is the most practical move, completely killing the game. I still tried a little bit. I played h5. He traded the rooks. Now he played the most accurate move, which is g5, just completely locking everything. I was hoping maybe he takes, I take back, and then maybe with some knight f4, I force the pawn to h4, and then try to put some pressure here. But still, even here, this is pretty much holdable without any issues. But he played g5. I played knight e7. I wanted to put this knight on f5 and eye both pawns on h4 and d4, but he just played king f1. And I was like, what am I even doing here? There's literally one weakness on d4, and both knights are defending it, so there's no way I can win it. If I start bringing my king all the way, then my f7 pawn is a huge weakness with this strong g5 pawn now. So I basically can't make any progress. I was even thinking a little bit about going here and then going with some f6, but then it creates two weaknesses for me on e6 and g6. And I was like, if I want to like really overpress this, I might even lose. So I just played knight d5 and offered him a draw, which I think it was fair because position is just 100% equal now. It's zeros and there are thousands of moves. I mean, not thousands of moves, of course, but many, many moves for white that keep equality, and it's not even difficult. So I offered a draw and he accepted, and even though draw with black against an FM is not the end of the world, but I was really disappointed. And I think the big turning point of the game, which made the game really difficult, was here. Until this point, I played amazing chess, great positional game, but I just played rook d8 without thinking about the danger of my opponent's idea, going knight c5, bishop e4, and trading my bishop pair. If I had gone b6, keeping my bishop pair and paralyzing white's position, I'm pretty confident that I would have won this game and I would have won the tournament. But unfortunately, I played rook d8, and credit to my opponent who found a lot of great moves under a lot of pressure in this game and managed to slowly but surely equalize the game and get a well-earned draw at the end of the day. So draw was a fair result at the end of the day. I was pressing with black the whole time, but I can't say I deserved to win this game with the technique that I showed and allowing a lot of counterplay. So credit to my opponent who drew the game, and I was a little disappointed, but still I was having a great tournament. 3.5 out of 4. A draw with black wasn't the end of the world, and we're going to the last round with me and my opponent both having 3.5 points, and we were the leaders of the tournament. So the last round would have decided who's going to win the tournament and who's going to finish second or even third. So I'm going to cover the last round, which is against Emmanuel Cott, in another video, but hope you guys really enjoyed this recap. Make sure to smash the like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel to be notified about the future content coming out. I will try to post the last round of the tournament maybe tomorrow or maybe a day after tomorrow on Tuesday, but I will do it before my next tournament, which is going to be in this upcoming weekend. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the recaps. Make sure to let me know your thoughts about this game in the comments down below. And thank you so much again for watching. Really appreciate it. Have a great one and see you soon. Goodbye.